I think they see the Abraham Accords, which were the most significant step forward towards peace in the Middle East for like 75 years. They see the Abraham Accords as an existential threat. This is a last-ditch attempt by the Iranian mullahs to use the Islam against Jews story to prop up their own dismal reign.
What might be a psychological analysis as to where Jew hatred and anti-Israel sentiment come from these days? Take a look at this clip over here with Piers Morgan and Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson goes into great detail as to where he believes Jew hatred and Israel hatred come from in our world today. So we'll watch this clip together and then talk about it. But first, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch. Check this out.
I mean, I can tell you what I think is going on to the degree that you can reduce it to something quickly explicable. You know, I think Iran is desperate because of the tenuous hold on power that the mullahs now have in Iran, given their own citizens' rebellion. I think they see the Abraham Accords, which were the most significant step forward towards peace in the Middle East for like 75 years. They see the Abraham Accords as an existential threat. This is a last-ditch attempt by the Iranian mullahs to use the Islam against Jews story to prop up their own dismal reign. But I'm rooting hard for the Abraham Accords signees, and I hope they have the courage of their convictions, and I hope they can see that their way forward is the most appropriate way forward for the good of the Muslim world. Or what, are we going to stay in some 14th century conflict between the fundamentalist Muslim world and the Jews? Jesus, that sounds, you know, we've had enough of that, haven't we? I'm also more sensitive to any signs of anti-Semitic catastrophe from studying the Holocaust for the length of time that I did, and I've always regarded Jews as the canary in the coal mine, and I think the reason that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine is because they're a successful minority. You know, and if a culture can tolerate a successful minority, it's pretty damn robust and it's not very resentful. And as soon as a culture starts to get resentful, the Jews make an easy target, because they're a minority, and so that's an easy target to begin with, but then they're the minority that has the temerity to be successful. And that really brings the resentful out of the rat holes. And I've seen a rise in anti-Semitism online over the last 3 years. It's just stunning to behold, on the right and on the left, but jointly. Well, maybe we could start the peace process with Israel without putting the Palestinians first. And that had been off the table conceptually in the State Department, as far as I've been informed, forever. And then it was proposed during the Obama era and it was rejected. And then it was proposed during the beginning of the Trump era and rejected, but eventually they carried the day. And then they did do an end run. And I think that was actually good for the typical Palestinian, because it put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Palestinian authorities, who are basically tyrants, who are more than willing to use their own citizens as cannon fodder. It put a lot of pressure on them to actually do something moving towards a genuine peace, which is why now that's why Iran is so desperate to scuttle the Accords, I think.
Of course.
You know? So I think the way through Hamas, all things considered in the medium to long run, is to desperately extend the Abraham Accords as rapidly as possible. That's not a military victory, but you know, it's easy to do this from the armchair. Well, you laid out what are the two sets of valid counterclaims. I mean, there's another complicating factor too. You know, you said that you know your moral back is up because of the continual toll in civilians in Palestine, especially among people who, let's say, weren't even born when they first came to power. And so it's very difficult to look at that and see it as anything but unjust. But then it begs a whole other set of questions too, doesn't it? It's like, well, if your government is a totalitarian band of armed criminal thugs, what responsibility do you bear for that as the subjected people? And, it's not like I know the answer to that. But, I see in my own country, in Canada, that things are slipping and sliding in all sorts of pathological directions, and people are letting it happen. And if you let that happen long enough, well, things get very, very bad. And they have got very, very bad in Palestine. And the answer to whatever tyranny Israel might be exerting over the Palestinians isn't for the Palestinians to exert even more tyranny over themselves, especially not in concert with a third party like Iran, who's perfectly willing to sacrifice them at any point. And so now, and then that question emerges, well, what responsibility do the Palestinians bear? Well, then I think we start to touch on more metaphysical issues. It's like, well, the Palestinians, like all people, bear the responsibility to live in truth and to stand up to tyranny in their deeds, their attention and their deeds and their actions. Because if you don't, you pay for that, and so do your children, right? And then so do your grandchildren, and so do your great-grandchildren. And, there seems to be something unjust in that why did the children suffer? And the biblical answer to that has always been, well, the children suffer for the sins of their forefathers. And you might think, well, it's pretty unfair that the world is set up that way. It's like, hey, it might be unfair, but it is set up that way, and it does beg the question. What responsibility do the people who are living under the thumb of totalitarians have for the fact that they're living under the thumb of totalitarians? And the answer isn't none. So this is why I'm a psychologist, not a politician. I would say,
but
because,
I think it's a really interesting question. It's also an interesting question. Why won't Arab states around Gaza take in Palestinian refugees? I mean, these are legitimate questions.
Right. Well, there's a lot of chain and saber rattling about how tyrannical Israel is, and of course, they're held to a very higher moral standard. But the prison that is Palestine has walls on sides that aren't Israeli. So, and that no one, certainly not the progressives, will never talk about that, and that's partly because all the oppressed people are equally morally virtuous, and so the fact that the Arabs won't take in the Palestinians, you can't even bring that up because, of course, the Arabs themselves are victims of Western colonialism, which is, one of the most absurd propositions ever set forth by anyone about anything. But, here we are, and it is quite a miracle in some ways that the multidimensional fact of Palestinian enslavement isn't discussed in a much more forthright manner. There's many people are building the walls that make Palestine into whatever prison it is. And perhaps the Israelis are playing their role, but they're by no means the only actors.
Let's talk about the response of progressives, and in particular, what's happening on student campuses, particularly in America. I've been struck by two things. One, the horrifying immediate response, not just in America, but when you saw mobs in Sydney, Australia, chanting "Gas the Jews," when you saw huge protests by the Israeli embassy in Kensington and West London, near where I live, all celebrating. This is all within hours of what happened on October the 7th. You saw similar scenes in America. So the gut reaction of many young people appeared to be celebrating what had happened. And you even had there was a Cornell professor who was heard in public saying how exhilarated he was by what happened, and still hasn't been fired. And these are people who've driven this cancel culture for many years now, where if you use the wrong pronoun, they want you eradicated, fired, shamed, abused, and so on. But here, if you celebrate the actions of a terrorist organization in killing 1,500 people, you actually don't lose your job. Students who beamed pro-Hamas rhetoric onto the building at George Washington University, they haven't lost their places at that university. So even for the most heinous possible thing that you could do which might warrant cancellation, the people who've driven cancel culture spare themselves.
Well, this shows you how shallow the oppressor narrative really is. Oppressed oppressor narrative really is. George Orwell famously said that the typical middle-class socialist didn't love the poor, they just hated the rich. And I think the oppressor-oppressed narrative gives people moral license to identify the oppressor and to hate them resentfully with a good conscience. Plus, it's also extremely simple-minded, you know, and this is one of the problems with what's being taught in universities, and even much more broadly than that now. The notion is we can view all human social relations and the past itself through a meta-Marxist narrative that proclaims that there are only oppressors and victims, and that all you have to do to be moral is to be on the side of the victim. Now, the shadow side of that is that once you proclaim your moral superiority and you're on the side of the victim, well, number one, you don't have to think anymore. You just have to identify the two sets of players. And number two, you're moral without effort, because all you have to do is feel sorry for the victims. And then consequence number three is the oppressor, being intrinsically evil, can be the target of everything that's resentful and bitter and absolutely dreadful about you. Now, that's the standard narrative that's being taught on university campuses, and the Palestinians play the role of victim. And so you can't argue against the Palestinian cause, let's say, if you were inclined to, without simultaneously having to face the weight of every single person who's adopted the oppressor-oppressed narrative, upending that. And there's no way the university, not in the state they're in now, there's no way that's going to fly. And so we see exactly what happened. The narrative's already in place. All oppressed people are innocent and virtuous victims. Well, so then when something like this happens and you see the Palestinian victims rise up against their evil Jewish overlords, then it's time for celebration. You know, and we forget entirely that the evil Jewish overlord story was the same story that the Germans used so successfully. And we also forget, and this is very interesting in relationship to Iran, I was reading a book by Stefan Zweig yesterday about turn of the century Vienna, just at the end of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the dawning of the movements that eventually morphed into Nazism in Germany. And one of the things Zweig pointed out was that, you know, if you're a corrupt, oppressing psychopath who's hell-bent on exploiting the population, and you want to deflect that, the Jews make a constant, positive, universal target, right? Because they tend to be disproportionately successful. And you can just say, well, you know, I'm not the oppressor here. It's those successful Jews. And that's being played out now. That's the disguise of left-wing anti-Semitism.
I mean, it's a terrifying...
We don't hate the Jews, we just love their enemies.
It's been said many times that the core of hatred for Jews and for Israel on the left stems from a Marxist view of the world, where there is only two types of people, the oppressor and the oppressed. And what defines someone as an oppressor is success, and what defines someone as oppressed is unsuccess. Nothing else is a factor, nothing else functions as a variable. If you are successful, you did it, you got that way because you oppressed other people. And so since the Jewish people are perceived as successful as a whole, as a group, or Israel is seen as successful as a nation, then they are deemed oppressors, right? They are oppressors because they are successful. And if the Palestinians or many in the Arab world or so forth are not successful, doesn't factor in that they elected Hamas, doesn't factor in other choices that have been made either governmentally, culturally, or what have you, the fact that they are not successful attests to the fact that they are oppressed. And that is this skewed Marxist viewpoint of the world. So in that viewpoint, the Jews or Israel or anyone that fits the bid of success also fits the bid of oppressor. And so this skewed mentality has to be called out and identified, because it has people who in theory would be wanting the right thing, in theory, and it might be a stretch to, but at the end of the day are siding with some of the worst people and worst ideologies, all because of this oppressor-oppressed skewed mindset. If you like this content overall, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch. Take care.